Hello and welcome to Negotiating Ideas, a podcast about political thought on democracy and pluralism. My name is Omar Sadr and I'm a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Governance and Markets. Today I'm excited to bring to you a fantastic brand new edited volume titled Power, Authority in Afghanistan, Rethinking Politics, Intervention and Rule. Where I have contributed a chapter on how the Third Republic of Afghanistan between 2004 and 2021 failed due to its inability to sustain meaningful pluralism. This book is edited by three distinguished scholars, Anna Larson, Dipali Mukhopadhyay, and Omar Sharifi. And I'm really glad today to have Anna with me in this episode. Anna Larson is a writer and researcher who has spent some time in Afghanistan and worked in Afghanistan since 2004. She has taught in SOAS, the University of London, and Tufts University. Her PhD in 2013 explored concepts and forms of democratization in Afghanistan. Anna, welcome and thanks for accepting the invitation.
Oh, thank you. No, it's a real honor to be here. Thanks, Omar.
Of course. Let me ask you first, what this book is about and how did you come up with the idea? So I have read it and I have a chapter, as I said. I'm really interested, and probably the ones who will be looking forward to read this book, they want to know what this book is about and how did you come up in a critical juncture when I think the Republic fall apart in 2021. And you guys came up with this idea to get together a number of scholars, not just Afghanistan nationals, but also internationals, some of the internationals and nationals. So tell us more about the book.
Sure. Thank you again so much for inviting me to talk, Omar. It's really, really fantastic to talk about this book because it was such a meaningful project, I think, for me and also for my co-editors, Dipali and Omar. And so, let me tell you, it's about deep politics, essentially. And more specifically, it's about better understanding the relationships between power holders and the people they govern in Afghanistan. But it argues that to understand these relationships properly, we need to consider them from many angles, not just one. And so it brings together scholarship on history, on security studies, on political economy, anthropology, religion, gender, institutions, and other disciplines as well, to provide what we think is a very rich and deep understanding of the way that power and authority are constituted in Afghanistan. So in doing so, we hope it provides a tool for those who are seeking to understand current political processes in the country, but also potential trajectories going forward as well. So how did it come about? Well, you mentioned the fall of the Republic. It actually started before then. So it's been a long project. But it came about because I was originally asked to review a proposal for a new handbook on Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And so I was sent a proposal to look at. And when I read it, my initial thoughts were just that it seemed to reiterate approaches to understanding Afghanistan that had been written so much about already from the perspectives of those who had published very widely already for decades on the country and whose standpoints on how to approach political analysis were very well established. And of course, there's nothing wrong with combining the valuable work of these authors in a new volume. Nothing wrong at all. I mean, it's always good to hear from distinguished scholars of Afghanistan. But there was so much missing. And there were so many newer perspectives from a new generation, particularly of Afghan scholars, that were not considered in the lineup that was included in this proposal. So after saying that in my review, I was approached by the publishers to come up with an alternative proposal.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So that's what I did. And that was accepted, which was great. And then I thought this could be a really exciting prospect because it might provide an opportunity to facilitate new conversations around the analysis of politics in Afghanistan. But then August 2021 happened. So this was all kind of late 2020, I guess, initially. And then August 2021 happened. And it seemed then even more important to provide a space for new post-intervention analysis of the Third Republic and the recording of lessons learned in that time, but also of the historical lessons of the past and thoughts about future paths as well. Even though I knew at this point going in that it was going to be extremely excruciatingly hard for the contributing authors to work through this project when so much was going on, back in Afghanistan. So I talked at this point to my good friends Dipali and Omar and asked if they would want to join me on the project potentially, especially because our combined networks were able to then reach a great number of Afghan scholars we knew, who we then approached with our call for papers for the volume.
Sure. Yeah, you touched upon how the idea came up by looking at another proposal and reviewing that proposal. And you're right, so much has been written on Afghanistan, both scholarly and policy. In terms of content, you guys bring in a few classic already published authors also back to this book and give it another life here. But there are also new ones. So tell us about the content of the book. What is different when you have this title, Power and Authority in Afghanistan? You touched upon it, but if you compare it and contextualize it within broader literature of Afghanistan studies or political science literature, when we talk about these ideas like power, legitimacy, and authority, what is new in this book?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's new within the Afghanistan literature because it is written from a post-intervention perspective. So a lot of the volumes that have been written before were written during the intervention. And I think being able to sort of look back retrospectively gives us a very different set of perspectives for a start. Secondly, our volume prioritizes the perspectives of Afghan and international scholars who conducted their fieldwork during the First Republic. And then after prioritizing these, it then puts them into conversation with, as you say, 3 previously published articles that we think are seminal to understanding Afghanistan sort of in the past 25 years, but also then with some op-eds, if you like, or reflection pieces from people who've been observing Afghanistan for a really long time. So that combination, we feel, firstly prioritizes those newer perspectives, but it also then links them back into conversation with sort of a longue durée perspective as well. So I think that's different. It's a unique structure that we've come up with in this book. But thirdly, again, as I mentioned before, this book's take on power and authority is very different from others in the political science literature because it doesn't identify one framework. So we're not just looking at it from a state building perspective. We're not looking at it just purely based on political institutions. We're not just looking at securitization. And those 3 tend to dominate the literature in political science when you're talking about Afghanistan. And it's also not just historical either. There's some fantastic historical works that cover, very saliently, Afghanistan's complex and political history. And we have some of those chapters in our book as well. But the combination of looking at how politics intimately connects with religion, how it connects with gender, how it connects with political structures, governmentality, practices of labeling, land tenure, coup proofing, all of these things. I think bringing them together provides a really different set of perspectives and a deeper understanding of political authority.
Sure. No, I really love the way the structure, the book's organized in terms of the longer academic pieces, but also commentaries. So it reaches broader audience, but not just, I mean, people can use it to teach probably undergrads in universities, but at the same time, for a common reader, also there would be so many things to draw from this book. Now, let me come to you yourself as a writer and as an academic. You studied elections and you studied democracy in Afghanistan. So, if I may ask you, what would be the best lens? Because you said this book is not looking to Afghanistan from a particular lens. It's much more you're playing with the concepts and allowing the authors to take their own standpoint. So, if I may ask you, as a political scientist, what would be the best lens to understand the Third Republic of Afghanistan? I mean, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, which is no more, as far as politics governance is concerned.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a tough question, given that I've just described how I think it's better to have, a much broader set of frameworks to analyze politics with. But in general, I tend to gravitate towards historical institutionalism, and I tend to follow the likes of Charles Tilly in that respect, precisely because of its broad historical character and the propensity to explain events as chains of historical trajectories and compare them across similar contexts without trying to come up with universal trends for things. So I resonate with that sort of historical institutionalist approach. But my PhD attempted to apply Charles Tilly's framework for democratization to the Afghan case, and it came up short. So I tried, but essentially failed to apply Tilly to the Afghan case for a number of reasons, because he's trying to measure democratization in his book Democracy in various different countries, and when you applied his framework to Afghanistan, I found that while it explained a lot about how democratization can be measured in broad terms, it didn't go far enough for me. And I was finding, for example, evidence of democratic practices and principles in the politics of consensus and deliberation in local councils, for which there had been no formal elections. And also, I was finding that elections, as they were implemented at the time, for example, provincial councils and parliament, were in some cases hindering these democratic practices. And so, Noah Coburn and I wrote about that in our book, Derailing Democracy. So I think, I was having trouble applying Tilly to the Afghan case, and I was finding that, there were gaps that needed to be filled. So that's why I'd say I tend to follow this sort of historical institutionalist way of looking at things, but again, can see that there's some problems with that approach. I also think that it's impossible to analyze the Third Republic without considering the political economy of international intervention.
Sure.
And I think that the way in which aid and military intervention affected incentive structures and the political norms and processes there was profound, but also that it worked the other way around too, in that existing incentive structures and political processes affected the institutions that the intervention brought in as well. So I guess in summary, my answer to your question is a little bit of historical institutionalism, a fair amount of political economy analysis, and then everything else as well.
That's wonderful. And I do agree with you. I mean, in terms of, I see some of the analysis where they apply sort of IR framework where you have three distinct level of analysis: individual, state, and international politics, with very less interaction with each other. On the other hand, and I think what is useful to explain case of Afghanistan is kind of global studies framework where constantly there is a kind of dual impact between local and global.
Yeah.
Structures, as you said, which already existed, they shaped the intervention. Intervention, on the other hand, incentivize certain things. And I think it's much more important for scholars who study Afghanistan, which is not I don't want to exceptionalize also Afghanistan, that some people will say, well, this is a quite unique case and what we have to do differently. But I mean, this global local interaction is much more important. And in terms of your framework on democratization, and I have written in this volume on deliberative democracy and pluralism, to my idea also, if one wants to explore how pluralism failed in Afghanistan, typically one cannot draw and apply a theory, particularly Western centric, let's say multiculturalism, to explain case of Afghanistan. That cannot simply explain what's going on in Afghanistan, either in terms of how it failed or otherwise. That nuance is much more important, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. I think any analysis that doesn't take into account the impacts of the international intervention and the political economy that was sort of developed around it really misses it misses such a significant set of political changes that it doesn't really grasp what was going on at the time. So.
Yes. And this brings me to another question that you, I think, beautifully articulated in the introduction, saying that very dominant concepts that has been at least occupied political science literature in the last 2 decades, like failed state, good governance, post-conflict governance, these cannot explain case of Afghanistan. So you not only challenge methodologically, but also you challenge these concepts, which has been not used just in case of Afghanistan, but for example, issues like post-conflict and failed state about African countries. So the question would be, what would be alternative? New epistemological approaches to power and authority that we can probably look at it?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to look at what the frameworks like these were designed for. And I think one of the reasons I really struggle with them is that they were brought in essentially, so we're talking about failed states, frameworks, or fragile states, or good governance, this kind of thing. They were brought in, particularly in the early years of the intervention, and were designed for international donors, essentially to help them, if you like, make legible the Afghan context. And here I'm borrowing from James Scott, but that's why they're limited, because they were created with already prescribed parameters and assumptions, right? Such as the idea about what legitimacy is or what participation is, free and fair elections, even the terms state and citizen. Whilst I'm not saying they don't apply to the Afghan case, I'm saying they come in with a baggage, if you like. They are normative. They have normative assumptions tacked on to them. And so these are applied to the Afghan case in these big frameworks, and then they're made to fit the context so that the donors could understand better and quantify better, and I think that's key, the extent of their influence and the outputs of their own taxpayers' money. And of course, this is understandable. Their responsibility is to show their own taxpayers, that the money is being spent well, etc. But these frameworks then have to be recognized for what they are and for what they're not. And I think they're not holistic mechanisms for political analysis. So, and yet they are sometimes portrayed as such.
Sure.
And so, in addition, almost without exception, they fail to take into account the impact of the international intervention itself
Mm.
in furthering instability.
Sure.
And so, they're not self-reflexive. They don't have a
Mm.
category that says, okay, well, this state is failing because there's so much money that's being, you know, given out without any oversight and contributing to, institutional corruption or something like that. They don't have those sort of self-reflexive frameworks built in. And so, in our book, we suggest then, like you highlighted, that these are not good enough. That these frameworks don't really work well, and that instead there are sort of three essential components that could be used to make a better framework. Now, we don't prescribe this framework. We don't come up with the sort of the new version that people should then take and use as is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we hope people will use our ideas and then move forward with them. So we suggest that, first of all, you need to look at logics of rule, so how
Sure.
power is conducted from the perspective of the power holders, and then
Mm-hmm.
legacies of intervention, which in
Mm.
itself then sort of allows for a sort of post-colonial perspective, if you like, on the political landscape in Afghanistan. And then also, finally, the dialectic or the relationship between central power and those governed by it, which we've chosen to call recognition and resistance. But this is just a start. So those were our three categories, and we divided our chapters into those three sections.
Mm.
And I think if you combine those three, then you do get the basis of a holistic political framework that you could
Yeah.
use for analysis. But again, it's not something we prescribe. It's a
Yeah.
set of ideas, and we hope people will take it forward.
Yeah. 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 And use of concepts, you have been so conscious that you have avoided using concept of legitimacy, and you have stated that because of its normative dimension, you didn't want to include that at least in the title of the book.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. So on legitimacy, that one is interesting because obviously quite a few of our contributing authors choose to use this term, and they use the term in their own ways, and they defend it, and they do a really good job of that. We didn't choose it for the title of the book or in any of the main sections because it can be construed in many ways, and also international actors in the past, and particularly my own compatriots, have a history of misunderstanding what is considered legitimate by Afghans. So right back to, for example, the time of the First Anglo-Afghan War and the British reinstallment of Shah Shuja, for example, as king, the British assumed that his lineage and his lineage alone would trump any claim that Dost Muhammad had to the throne. And yet it actually turns out that in spite of his Barakzai credentials, Dost Muhammad had made a name for himself and cultivated his own legitimacy to the extent that Shah Shuja was toppled, pretty quickly. So what the British failed to realize at the time was that their own involvement in and of itself helped to delegitimize the king in the eyes of Afghans who were already adept at resisting external imposition. Right. So
Yeah.
I think that's just one sort of very historical example of how legitimacy can be misinterpreted, misunderstood across cultures and across countries. More recently, many Western analysts made assumptions about what would contribute to bolstering the government's legitimacy in the intervention years, for example. And many of them made an explicit connection between service provision on the one hand and government legitimacy on the other. So if the government could be seen to provide services, it was then assumed that it would garner legitimacy in the eyes of the Afghans who were receiving those services. But this was misguided because people, first of all, saw that the money for the projects and the services came from donors, not from the government.
Yes.
and also, not incidentally, from their own taxes. So there was no ownership of these services. And second, the projects were often poorly maintained or badly managed. And then third, there was little oversight, and often obvious incidences of corruption in the agencies that were charged with distributing the services. So actually, service provision in many ways delegitimized the government, so it was kind of the opposite way around. So it's a long way of answering a question about legitimacy, but because it can be so easily sort of misconstrued and assumptions are sort of connected to it, and because it's also so hard to measure, and because it changes over time as well, what made something legitimate once might now actually mean less, given a change in the context. We decided to um, avoid using the term explicitly anyway, and focus on power and authority instead.
Sure. And coming back to the way that we understand the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan scholarly, in terms of scholarship. So you here in the book divide it into three, propose to understand it in three different periods and episodes. The very first couple of years, as you consider it as a kind of naive optimism, somewhere between 2001 and 2007. And then the second era is denialism and mission creep, where lots of intervention, increase in intervention, both in terms of military and financial aid. And finally, the failure and decline into civil war. Mm-hmm. But in the book, also, many other contributors are cautious of clearly demarcating between post 2001 and pre 2001, in the sense that they see continuities.
Yes.
Between, so one should put it in a larger context, but also for some certain analytical purposes, we have to do this periodization. So tell us more about how did you come up with this? And I think it's very interesting to explain case of Third Republic.
Well, let me just clarify here that when we were making that division, we were dividing the intervention into three parts and not the Republic as a whole. So really, in that section of the introduction, we were just trying to look at the international involvement and split that into three parts. And our aim in doing so, I think, was to highlight the differing approaches of international actors as time progressed. So I don't think this periodization helps us to understand Afghanistan as a whole in the 21st century. But I do think it roughly helps to explain how international engagement shifted over the years. So it's just one aspect of the Third Republic. And in turn, as I suggested earlier, this then impacted the political landscape itself by influencing incentive structures and political norms in different ways. So in 2001 to 2007, the internationals were largely optimistic about the prospects for stability, economic development, and state building more broadly. And this was echoed, I think, in Afghans' trust in the new institutions that were forming. And if you look at, for example, who was running for parliament in 2005, you had a really broad sweep of people from different backgrounds: teachers, NGO workers, the wives of warlords, a whole bunch, and business people. So a real mix of people that were running for parliament in 2005, which indicates to me that there was some trust that this could be a new venture, that this could be somewhere where voices could be heard from different perspectives. I mean, that's not even to mention the different ethnic groups and other groups that were putting themselves forward. So I think you can garner something from that broad spread of people that were applying to be candidates for parliament. The other thing you could look at sort of at the very local level, ordinary folks are building new additions to their homes. The diaspora were returning to the country, with returns, I think, peaking in 2005, 2006, something like that. Then from around 2008 to 2014, I think you had a real shift, something that I certainly witnessed at the time anyway. And that was this sort of denial and mission creep. People were starting to describe the security situation as a war for the first time. And also, there was a huge increase in suicide bombings and a change in approach as well. In 2008, you had, I think, the first suicide bombing that attacked international civilians, not just military bases. And so, signifying a bit of a shift there. Also, I think at this point, Karzai was starting to talk about the Taliban as upset brothers. Again, an indication of a shift. The civilian surge coming in this point, and many more blast walls. So even the topography of Kabul, if you were driving around it, started to look very different between 2008, 2014 than it had done before. So all the concrete blast walls and things just popping up everywhere, and internationals very much being contained. And I mean internationals, particularly working for different embassies and the diplomatic missions, but contained and unable to access different parts of the country, which then limited the information they were privy to, and made their work difficult. And so I think you can see sort of a shift at that point. And then after the 2014 election and the beginning of troop withdrawal, Obama had set that date for troop withdrawal. This essentially was a signal to the Taliban that the end of the international military engagement was in sight. And so, it was a sort of call to wait it out and step up attacks, along with a sense of denial among the Afghan elite, perhaps, that the internationals would ever leave. So I think I don't want to hold fast to those 3 dates, but I do think that noting the shifts in attitude from the internationals helps to understand a little bit about the other political happenings in the country at that time.
Sure. Yeah. And then finally, if we talk about the current moment of Afghanistan, the Taliban. So the book also covers that. I think we have a few chapters talking and unpacking the Taliban. Your analysis is that the Taliban, despite the fact that they aim for a long-term rule, but they are not cautious of the way the authority should be legitimized in order to ensure their long-term rule. As popularly in Afghanistan, even amongst the common people, when a country is war-torn, people prefer stability. So the Taliban probably may flag that stability as one of their key advantages. But we know that that's not sufficient. And you also highlight that one. Now, given that, how can we understand the Taliban's mentality and psyche towards power and the way that they want to rule and govern the country? Are like, I don't want to say very simplistic things like the tourists are not rational or the Taliban are not rational. Definitely, they have a set of ideology which drives their behavior and the way they govern. And they are also cautious. They're very realistic in terms of how they should manage society. But why, as you highlight, why they are not understanding the cracks and the essence of authority, given the previous experience in 90s and also the longer, at least modern history of Afghanistan?
It's a really good question. And let me set out right from the start that I am not an expert in the Taliban at all. And it was wonderful to have experts on the Taliban contribute to the book, to highlight some of the research that's going on into into how they make the decisions that they do, and why they make those decisions. So, but I think it's a really interesting question, and maybe some of that misunderstanding can be demonstrated in reactions to the surveillance cameras in Kabul, I think, that were installed a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if you, or I should just summarize quickly, but I think something to the tune of 90,000 video surveillance cameras have now been installed.
Yes, BBC had a report on that, but
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Chinese are cooperating with the Taliban in terms of providing that technology.
Right. Well, yes. Yeah. So, and then you see the reactions to that from the local people in Kabul, and there's outrage. Firstly, that they're being watched all the time, and it seems that whilst the Taliban assure people that it's going to be just for reducing crime, actually, it can be used, to monitor behavior and to quell dissent and this kind of thing. But also that people are being asked to pay for it. So the security cameras are being levied as kind of taxes on local people, sort of with the excuse that this is to protect them and for their own security.
Not just that, but they have also asked neighborhoods and
Yeah.
households to purchase on their own security cameras.
Yeah.
And then the Taliban security forces or militias, they reserve this right for themselves to enter any house that they want to inspect those the records.
Yeah.
So it's even your, personal private property is no more in your own control. So the Taliban makes you set the cameras, and then they will come and enter your house to take a look.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I think this is an example of the sort of overreach that is likely to really get under people's skin, like to really annoy people, and not just that, but also, really worry them. And I think whilst on the one hand you can see that the Taliban, with their sort of imposition of central control and their basically the setting up of a police state, has this sort of authoritarian character, it's missing the lessons from the past, where we see time and time and again that when you step over too far into people's private lives and people's sort of space where they can be separate from the state, then you incur resistance. And it's extremely difficult with people right now, with the economic situation the way it is, and with so many hardships being faced by so many Afghans across the country. You can understand why, and finally to achieve some respite from insurgent attacks. You can understand why people are not taking to arms right now. But I am convinced that the shelf life of this approach is limited. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And from historical analysis of politics in Afghanistan for the last 200 years, you can see that there are lines that once they're crossed, incur resistance, and a lot of resistance. And so that's what makes me tentative about sort of assigning this sort of term of authority to long-term authority to Taliban rule. And the other thing is, if you look in the past as well, you can see that, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that really undermines the authority of any governing power in Afghanistan is the perception that they are a puppet state and that there's interference from outside. And you mentioned China providing these security cameras. I think whilst at the moment the Taliban is doing a good job of portraying itself as an Afghan movement, that is staunchly nationalist and, resist as a post-colonial movement that's resisting and international interference and doing its own thing and telling Trump that he's emotional for, talking about the military equipment in Bagram and blah blah blah. I think they're going to have to make regional concessions at some point. They're already talking with India, they're talking with Uzbekistan, with Russia, with Iran. And so if it gets to the point where people think that external intervention is determining how they're governed, then again, that's going to undermine authority.
Of course. There's a well-known phrase from Thomas Hobbes which says, perception of power is power.
Yes.
And you say that about the perception of the people that they consider the Taliban as puppets. And I think the people of Afghanistan, to a large extent, that they're politically very sharp and conscious.
Yeah.
And the way that, for example, in certain neighborhoods and zones in Afghanistan, the Taliban are completely considered as an alien which doesn't resemble probably the locals. They came from somewhere else. And apart from the fact that they draw support from all authoritarian regimes, the fact that they harbor, let's say, TTP, which it's not a Afghanistan phenomena. It's similar to Taliban, and it follows the same model and the same ideology. But at the end of the day, even for the people in Kandahar, when the news came that people are angry and upset that they don't know and that Hibatullah is distributing lands for these TTP guys in Kandahar. So yeah, that tells a lot about how people perceives the Taliban.
Yeah.
No more, the Taliban do not associate. I think my assumption is that the Taliban with power and with authority. Instead, they are seen as much more dependent on a complex network of both West, the way that the United States was sending cash to Afghanistan, but also its own regional network of madrasas, ulama, and these tourists.
Yeah. I think also, with the divisions that seem to be emerging as well, there are always been divisions within the Taliban, but, with recent rifts over girls' education, and Stanexai apparently leaving the country supposedly for health reasons, but people are seeing these divisions, and I think that's important as well. As you say, this perception, if people perceive the Taliban to be a unified, controlling force, that's one thing. But if they see that there are, rifts and underlying facts, then again, that's an undermining of their authority.
On this division within the top rank of Taliban, I have my own understanding, and the sign of dissent's whole little savvy, I think, so far. And that is because the type of authority within the Taliban regime is quite unique. It is an ulama-centric, madrasa-centric regime, exclusively. If you're a cleric, if you're a Maulawi, then you have a legitimacy to rule. People like even, of course, Stanexai is not a mullah.
Nope.
He didn't have that power to push whatever he wanted to say, despite the fact that he constantly referred back to Quran and Hadith and Prophet says this and how we should govern and why justice and adl is important and adl is very central to Islamic political thought. But because he is not a mullah or he is not graduate of a madrasa, he didn't have a credential to talk about all of those. And my assumption is even Sarajuddin Akhani, who is very powerful to challenge the leader, he is not also the same. So he doesn't have that religious authority because the regime is centered around religious authority.
Right.
And tribe is important, but first comes religion. So these guys will have certain disagreements, but I don't know to what extent they will be able to undermine Hibatullah's religious authority. That is quite important.
Yeah.
Real politics may come very crucial at some point of time, but that will take time, I think.
Yes. Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that religious authority is such a huge component to the relationships that the Taliban have with their constituents. Yes. That, again, going back to sort of how you understand power and authority, without that, just you really miss a huge sort of segment of understanding, right? You can't understand the current regime in Afghanistan without considering religious authority. So, yeah.
All right. So with that, thank you so much, Anna, for talking to me in this episode. It was really a pleasure.
No, thank you. Pleasure's all mine.
And thanks to our listeners for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed listening to Anna Larson, and I hope we have convinced you enough to purchase a copy of this book, Power and Authority in Afghanistan. But apart from that, please subscribe to this podcast and make sure to share it with your own circle of friends and social media. Looking forward to talking to you in the next episode.